I thought this would take about 45, 50 minutes. I'll go at a cracking pace so you don't get too bored. But it is going back into ancient history, 1976. You may like to think what you were doing at that time. By then, I was a student at Loughborough University with plenty of free time during the summer holidays to go on this expedition to Ecuador. Well, it all started for me at a little market town called Skipton in the Yorkshire Dales, just on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, actually, as you can see there from this map. I'm sure some of you have visited that part of the world. There wasn't a great deal to do in Skipton, really. It's not like living in Cheltenham, but there are plenty of outdoor spaces to explore. This is the Parish Church at the top of the town, which some of you may know. There's often a market down the high street. I was a Boy Scout and got out into the hills, and they introduced me effectively to caves. I don't think the scout leaders meant us to go caving. In fact, they forbade it from happening, which made it all the more enticing. When I wasn't down caves, then through the working week, I was working in steel foundries, and that was before Mrs. Thatcher arranged for them all to go to China and Taiwan and places like that. So I was serving an engineering apprenticeship. I tried my hand at various sports. This is obviously rock climbing, a big old waterfall that's dried up now called Malham Cove. I guess some of you will have visited there. This is a friend of mine who went on to be a great rock climber, one of the best that Britain's ever produced. But I certainly couldn't keep up with him, and I much preferred team sports like caving. And so we'd go off at weekends to a place called Horton in Ribblesdale, where the Pothole Club had a cottage very conveniently situated next to a pub. I'd disappear all weekend. And I was so keen in those days, I'd even go caving on a Wednesday night. This is the sort of cave that we used to explore in the Yorkshire Dales. Back then, it was quite possible to move a few rocks to one side or set off some explosives, and you could go into new passages which had never been recorded before, which I always found very exciting. As Captain Kirk said, you know, to boldly go while we would to boldly crawl where no one had ever been before. And occasionally we'd get lucky and find wonderful passages like this, which nobody had ever seen before. And it felt quite a spiritual experience, to be honest. Certainly awe-inspiring to see such beauty in an unexpected place. In 1972, some of us had the opportunity to visit Iran. This was around the time of the Shah, just as he was coming to the end of his reign. And we were looking for the world's deepest cave. We started off at a mountain at about 10,000 feet up, and we went down about 2,500 feet. It wasn't in the end the deepest cave in the world. It was the deepest in Asia, so that was something. Around that time, I left my engineering apprenticeship and went to Loughborough University for 3 years. And as I said at the beginning, I had opportunity, because of the summer holidays, to go caving. But let me just give you a bit of background about how the caving trip got started. And it all goes back to a name you may remember from the distant past, somebody called Eric von Daniken, author of a book called Chariots of the Gods. He also wrote another book making phenomenal claims called The Gold of the Gods. And this was set in Ecuador and was following a story generated by this Roman Catholic priest. And he had been in the jungle working with the indigenous people, returned to Guayaquil in Ecuador after a few years with all sorts of apparent treasures, which he said had been left to him by the grateful inhabitants of this region. And he also claimed that there were tablets of gold plates hidden in a cave. So, and you only have to mention gold to people and they get interested. And so an expedition was launched locally, and he found this cave and searched around for the gold. It wasn't successful. He looked at the formation of the cave and he decided that those flat roofs and square walls must have been produced not naturally, but by little green men from outer space. And I know that sounds hard to believe, but there are people out there who want to believe that sort of stuff, and they buy books about it as well. So inside the book, Gold of the Gods, there's a few sentences which you can read for yourself there. A gigantic system of tunnels, thousands of miles in length, built by unknown constructors at some unknown date, lies hidden deep below the South American continent. Hundreds of miles of underground passages have already been explored and measured in Ecuador and Peru. That's only beginning, yet the world knows nothing about it. And one of these books fell into the hands of a Scottish engineer called Stanley Hall, and he decided he was going to organize an expedition. He realized, oh my goodness, it's a cave. I better get some cavers to help all the scientists get up and down the entrance shaft, which was about 130 feet deep. And so at that time, it fell to the club that I happened to be in to find sufficient members who were free to go and explore this cave. Well, we did have some background in caving, as you might imagine. Every year, we put up a gantry and set up a winch at a place called Gaping Gill, which is England's highest, well, deepest waterfall. It's 360 feet from the lip there right down into a big chamber. That's what it looks like from below. And it's free to go down. It's 10 to 15 pounds to get out again. The chamber is big enough to hold York Minster, and yet very few people actually get to see this. Around that time, Neil Armstrong had been up to the moon. And I won't bore you with the full details at this stage, but it's a very interesting story how this Scottish engineer called Stanley Hall managed to convince Neil Armstrong that he should be president of an expedition which would go hunting for alien life in the Amazon jungle. And if you look up Neil Armstrong's entry on Wikipedia, they don't talk about this at all, but they do give a reference in the footnote to him having been president of an expedition that went to Ecuador. So there's Neil in all his glory, put together in a compilation just before the expedition set out. So here we are, 30th of June, 1976, and there's a team of about 50 or 60 people from the UK, mostly scientists and military, and a similar sized team from Ecuador, again, mostly military and scientists. And we fly over to Miami, then catch a different flight into Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador. That's that tiny green country over on the left-hand side. This is the caving team, and as usual, I'm looking the wrong way just when the camera's taking the picture. But some of these are my close friends and others I got to know while we were out there. Here's Quito, capital of Ecuador. It sits at about 10,000 feet altitude. Spanish influence, obviously, from years ago. And our accommodation that night was in the military barracks. We weren't sure whether the guard was to keep bad people out or to keep us inside, but we were very obedient and we stayed inside the barracks for the night. As we were going to sleep, a load of people got off the back of a truck, well, several trucks, and we saw them next morning. They'd had a haircut. They were parading around this square having military exercises. What we didn't realize was a military coup going on at the time, and so the government were recruiting, in inverted commas, as many people as they could get to suppress the dissidents. Quick look round the city of Quito. Spanish influence there, Roman Catholicism very strong. New experiences for me as let me see, I would have been a 25-year-old back then. And being in the Andes, there were some spectacular mountains within sight. This is a volcano, an active volcano called Cotopaxi, which goes up to about 19,000 feet. Anyway, next morning we were summoned to the ambassador's residence, and there were various dignitaries there making speeches about what we were going to find inside these caves. There were going to be libraries of gold plates, apparently, sort of thing you'd expect in Tutankhamun's tomb, and would make a big impression on the world. At least that's what they were expecting. This is another view from the military map making block. And General Real was the guy on the Ecuadorian side charged with looking after us, and Major Brown from the Royal Green Jackets from the UK. So the two of them were responsible for logistics. And the first thing they had to do was get about 120 people out of Quito, 100 miles south down the Andes, to where we could catch a flight then for the final section taking us into the Amazon. And it was a spectacular ride in a bus, well, a convoy of buses actually, going down through this rift valley in the Andes, peering down every so often as we went round corners. And without exception, there was always a wreck hundreds of feet down at the bottom of these gorges. So it was quite a sobering experience. It's probably the longest time of prayer I've had in my whole life. Eventually, we stopped off for a brew at a little place called Ambato, but it was all day of a bus journey. And again, other views of volcanoes, massive waterfall. You could hear this from 2 or 3 miles away. Went round a corner and there'd been an avalanche that had blocked the road. So we had about a 2 or 3 hour wait then until they could get a digger up from a nearby town to clear the road. I think I must have taken a bit of a risk here because I got across the landslip to take this picture. We ended up then in a place called Shell Mera, which was named after the Shell oil company. We only had a night or two here, but the next day we were loaded into these small aircraft. I say loaded into the aircraft because the only space that was left for people was about a 2-foot gap. And so you laid down on top of all the luggage. We're just treated basically like baggage. This guy with the axe, you can see in commando gear, is one of the 2 SAS officers who were assigned to look after us. And I'll say a bit more about him at the end. His name's Steve Callan. So we flew into a jungle airstrip, had a briefing of sorts from Major Brown, who's there sitting at the chair. These are some of his men. Going back to the book I mentioned, Gold of the Gods, there's a reference in there to the location of this cave that goes down into supposedly hundreds of miles of passages. We were relying very much on the locals to get us to the cave entrance. Some of the Ecuadorian commandos had been airdropped into the jungle and they'd had their chainsaws and machetes and they'd cleared a landing strip so that the helicopters could get in there. But we thought it'd be a good idea to send an advanced party. And so they had these 2 rigid keel inflatable boats, and the military guys and 1 or 2 cavers jumped in there and set off up what was a tributary then to the Amazon River. Unfortunately, the plan didn't work. They were only gone for about 5 minutes. And next thing we knew, they were being swept downstream and went right past us for another mile or so because the force of the river was so strong. So that was a bit of a failure. Put us back a couple of days. Anyway, eventually they got some bigger helicopters and we were able to fly in. The leader of the caving team, a guy called Dave Judson, persuaded me to jump on an early flight. And so the 2 of us were amongst the first to get into the air. I regretted it fairly soon afterwards because every so often the aircraft would go through a terrible juddering noise and we'd drop about 50 feet. I looked across at the pilot and even he had beads of sweat on his forehead. Anyway, eventually, after about a 20-30 minute flight, we did land in a clearing in the jungle, which you can make out on the right-hand side. And there was hardly anybody around when Dave Judson and I jumped off the helicopter. We had just a minimal amount of caving gear, and his idea was to preempt the whole expedition by going down into the cave and seeing what was there without doing it in a siege tactics, just go and do it. We didn't have any backup, so if anything had gone wrong, we'd have been in fairly serious trouble. So there's my friend Dave Judson, who's the leader of the caving team. And the way we're getting down the cave is abseiling on a single rope through a friction device. It's 130-foot drop, so you can't come out on the rope hand over hand. We dropped an aluminium and wire ladder down to the bottom as well, so that we could climb out up there using what's known as a self-lifelining device to get us safely up the rope. Now, I should say that there was a book by Stanley Hall, the Scottish engineer I mentioned right at the beginning, which talked about this library of gold plates which we were going to find. And in his book there, he talks also about what Judson and me were doing when we went down the cave. The atmosphere at the entrance was silent and foreboding, almost primeval, whatever that means. Shafts of sunlight piercing through the foliage illuminated a shower of water cascading. Anyway, I won't bore you with that. You can come back and look at this some other time if you want. Further down the cave, there was another drop of about 30 feet, and we had a spare ladder for that. And we continued along to where we got to what was believed to be an artificially made tunnel. You can see the square cut features there. In fact, even the main passage, which was, as you can see, about 50, 60 feet high and 150 feet wide, had got the same kind of formation. And we immediately concluded that this wasn't the work of spacemen, but rather we'd got geologically very thinly bedded limestone, which was in an earthquake zone. So every so often there'd be a shuddering and a section of the roof would come down, leaving that square cut corner. That was our view anyway. And we didn't find any library of gold plates. So when we got back to the surface, there was a bit more of a camp atmosphere, and we sat around the fire that evening and told them what we'd found, which wasn't very encouraging, but at least it was, we were dealing with reality after that. So here I am. In those days, I had an attempt at a beard and hammering in a bolt here to anchor some equipment, because we had to reconstruct that gantry I was telling you about at Gaping Gill using natural materials that we could find. Here's some scenes of the construction process. We're very surprised halfway through this when a Roman Catholic priest arrived with his Sunday school, and they observed us for half an hour or so. I just thought how incredible that somebody has such a firm faith in Christianity that they would go and lose themselves effectively amongst primitive people. In the 1950s, the Jivaro, as they're known, had been head shrinkers, and yet the Christian faith had come to them. And whatever you think about the ethics of dealing with Stone Age communities, they'd changed their ways, and they'd taken on the Christian faith, at least to some extent. We were invited shortly after this to a baptism, and they were still carrying on some of their ancient tribal ways, because after the baptism, they were passing around a bowl of liquid, which was hallucinogenic. I skipped the hallucinogenic experience, but some of my mates had it. Here's the winch. Now, it was a window cleaner's winch, which a friend of ours who was a factory inspector had confiscated from a building site. I don't know if there's anything wrong with it. It worked perfectly well for us, and about 3 months later, he handed it back to that company. And we did have a generator. Now, this was a heavy thing to be shifting from the helicopter down to the entrance to the cave. It took about 6 or 8 men at a time, sliding down muddy bankings, but eventually we got it into place. Obviously, that worked off diesel, and we were able to get some power from that to keep the winch going. Some views down inside the cave. The word Los Teos, which is the name of the cave, comes from the name of the oil birds which live down there. And they nest high up in the roof, as you can see, along with bats and various other creepy crawlies. You're actually walking over a surface which is constantly on the move, with cockroaches, spiders, and quite a strong smell of ammonia. The best place to sit down was obviously on the rocks. And right at the bottom of the cave, we met a stream which formed a pool. And this must have been responsible for carving out most of the cave over many thousands, tens of thousands of years. And as far as we were concerned, that was the limit. That was as far as we could go. One of my friends, Dave Checkley, swam into the pool and saw that the roof disappeared underwater, and he wasn't feeling very brave that day. None of us were. So we called it a day for the downstream progress. And sure enough, that was virtually, we did a survey and found that that was virtually at river level, about 500, 600 feet below the entrance. We set to work then and drew up a survey of the cave. This is like a sideways view of it. And you can see there's all the measurements involved, and drawing it all up was quite a major undertaking, because it wasn't just a single passage. There was a maze of streams coming in from other areas, which we had to survey. Some of this was being recorded for us by a little company called Tree Films from Glasgow, and I'll say a bit more about them later. Here's a general view of the camp. I don't know if you ever watched, was it MASH, the Vietnam War series? I think it was meant to be a comedy, but I got that feeling we were in some kind of reenactment of MASH. The mud was incredible, and several of us went down with a First World War condition called trench foot, where because your feet are constantly wet day and night, the skin starts to fall off. One of the comforts we had obviously were meals, and military meals I felt were excellent. I wasn't too convinced about the camp chef when I first met him, because this is him there having a melon or something. He'd had a very unfortunate experience because he'd been to the loo, and it was built out over the side of a steep banking, and fortunately we'd only been using it for a few days, but he actually slipped on the wooden branches. He fell 6 or 8 feet down into all the brown stuff. Anyway, he cleaned himself up and he carried on cooking for us. There were one or two ladies around. This lady was the UK expert on hummingbirds. She's sitting next to the SAS guy I mentioned earlier with the axe, called Steve Callan. There were some interesting snakes. I think this one is a coral snake, and it's one of the most deadly snakes in the world. It alternates between orange and black and yellowy colour. It kind of put you on constant alert. There was a lot of rain. I mean, when you go into a rainforest with 300 inches of rain every year, you should expect rain, shouldn't you? But we certainly got it. You could almost you could say, oh, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the rain will be here any minute now. And sure enough, there'd be a deluge for an hour and a half or so, and then it would stop. Rather disappointingly, the logistics people in the army had given us the wrong tents. They'd given us desert tents for a tropical rainforest. Anyway, we had to make the best of it. We walked back and forth from the cave entrance to the camp, and really being underground was better than being on the surface most of the time. This is what it was like inside the tent where I was sleeping. And at night, we'd close up the entrance, of course, and whatever we did, moths would get in, because we'd have a light there to try and read, and the air would be so full of moths that they'd be falling into your cup of tea. Not very nice, really. And here are some of the local Ivaros Indians. Yeah, their view of reality was a bit different to ours. They had 3 levels of consciousness all going on simultaneously. Yeah, we didn't really understand them, but we smiled at one another, and they invited us back to their place for a brew. So it was a bit of a walk, maybe half an hour through the jungle, and then we got back to their little cottage. They only had a very narrow entrance to get inside. The reason being there were wild boar in the jungle then, and you didn't want a wild boar in your living room, so they had to make it narrow enough that these pigs with tusks on wouldn't get in and kill the kids. One of the guys, Dave Checkley from Ealing in North London, he really got into Indian culture in a big way. He moved out of the desert tents and he set himself up something which they call a basha. And it's just a construction of sticks and tarpaulins. But he was the most comfortable of any of us, really. And that was the view that he had every morning when he woke up. The leader of the caving team, Dave Judson, he too became a bit native, got friendly with a parrot. Well, a parrot got friendly with him, and everywhere Dave went, apart from underground, this parrot was on his shoulder. Anyway, getting back to the caving, we had the winch and gantry working quite well. It was quite slow though. A window cleaner's gantry doesn't move very fast. So we decided to speed it up, and we found a way of clipping somebody else on top of the cable so we could double the speed of the activities. It was rather a strange experience, as I remember, because the coil in the cable would gradually unwind as you were going down. And the more the cable went further down into the hole, the faster and faster you went. So by the time you'd spun round a few hundred times and stepped off into the cave, you really did feel as though you were in a different world. There we are, just about at the bottom and not a minute too soon. We had various kinds of scientists, every kind of ology you could think of, really. And this guy was a world expert in oil birds. So he used to knock them off the ledges with a stick and put them into a sack, take them back to the surface and examine them. And then he'd write a PhD about it. We also had somebody who was very good at bats. I think his name was Bob Stebbings. This is a vampire bat. One of the jobs that the scientists would give us cavers when we haven't got anything better to do would be to collect spiders for them. Now, this isn't your average spider in the UK. This thing is the size of your hand and it weighs about 2 pounds. And we developed a pretty good technique for catching them. We'd get a plastic bag and one person would put the thumbs on two edges of the plastic bag, and then the other person would quickly bring a third corner down. The spider would automatically jump up, and then you'd quickly close the bag, put it in a bigger bag, take it to the surface, and the scientists were really happy. There are also these things called whip scorpions, and these were even bigger, obviously not as heavy, but they were about a foot across. They usually hung around on the walls, so as long as you didn't touch the walls, you'd be all right. This was a social event on the surface, always muddy, but they don't look particularly happy, do they, really? But I think the reason is that was the day that the nurse of the year would come round to collect blood samples. And so that's why Dave on the left there is rolling up his sleeve. Here we are, the nurse of the year, Claire, and she was doing a study on physiological effects of stress on people over a sustained period of 4 or 6 weeks. But I can tell you, by far the most stressful thing we had to do was let her near us to take blood samples. So I have a feeling that would have distorted the results. Here's Dave Checkley, who's a big, strong lad, really. I mean, he chops down trees and drinks beer and everything, but maybe it just was her technique of inserting the needle that wasn't quite right. Here's some of the Ecuadorian Special Forces. That's Major Real, who we saw in his uniform earlier on, and some of his men. And they were really tough nuts. They could keep up with the caving team and carried loads of gear, so we made full use of them. They helped us with the surveying as well, some of the simpler bits of it. And they actually dug out another entrance to the system, which we called Deluge Pot and Commando Cave. And that actually linked up with the other passage, the main route into the cave. Just a few pictures of that way in, active streamway. Not the sort of place to be around when there's a tropical storm, because there's nowhere to hide. You just get into trouble. Lots of scrambling down. It was fairly easy, but every so often there'd be a big drop, which we tackled in the traditional way with a wire ladder and a lifeline. Any good pictures in here are attributable to my friend John Worley, who's a specialist in underground photography. Anyway, this was one of the most exciting trips because we didn't know where we were going. As we were exploring it, we didn't know it was going to go back into the main cave. And we ended up at this little waterfall, and we were obviously in a massive chamber. Our voices echoed all around. It was like being outside again at night. And we'd come into a connection with the main cave, and this is what it looks like. We ended up calling this feature the Amphitheater. Probably about 200 yards long, 100 foot high, 200 or 300 foot wide. As I said earlier, the military food was excellent, especially the rations that we could take down and enjoy underground. We then started exploring some of the side passages, following those streams back as far as we could to the surface. Some of the waterfalls were sporting, which is another way of saying they were difficult and you could fall off quite easily. And then every so often we'd find something really interesting. And here, this is a giant stalagmite. You're not going to see anything like this in Clearwell Caves. And that's David Balgoni anyway. He was one of the gentry, and he didn't flaunt it, but we tried to look after him, make sure he didn't have any accidents. This isn't a very good picture, but it shows like a bird's eye view of the cave and how it's developing as we explore more and more of it. We climbed over the top of that big stalagmite I mentioned, and we're pursuing an inlet stream to see if it could go back to the surface, but sadly it didn't do. You can see we're using a safety rope because you don't really want to fall in a place like that. It'd be very difficult to get you back to the surface and might be several days before getting to hospital. Anyway, just when we thought the cave was finished and we could go home, somebody was digging around on the surface and they found some pottery. And so some more people flew in, some more archaeologists from another university in Ecuador. And we started looking more carefully inside the cave, and quite close to the entrance, there was a little side passage. We didn't find anything on the way into this passage, but on the way out, we realized that our feet had uncovered some objects in the sand. And this was some more pottery. And this was all being filmed. And I don't know if you can see there's like a little figurine. There's a head on top of a piece of pottery. This brought great excitement. There were even seashells from the Pacific coast. And the theory developed that the seashells were a kind of currency, that they were so rare that they were valued by the locals for trading purposes. News of this got back to Cincinnati, and the president of the expedition, Neil Armstrong, decided it was time for him to make a personal appearance. So you can imagine that was a big, exciting day for everybody when he flew in and then caught a helicopter the last 20 miles or so to join us at the camp in the jungle. My mind immediately flashed back to his exploits. Was it 1969 that he went to the moon? And there's Neil Armstrong, obviously, and standing alongside him is the Scottish civil engineer Stanley Hall, whose wife persuaded Neil Armstrong to be honorary president. Everybody wants to meet Neil Armstrong, except the cavers. We decided we were just going to treat him like a normal human being. And guess what? He spent most of his time with us then. And because I was the health and safety officer, it fell to me to tie Neil Armstrong onto a safety rope. Well, I've always been good at tying bowlines around my own waist, but I must admit, doing it upside down on somebody else wasn't a very easy thing to do. And maybe Neil Armstrong realized I was a bit nervous. I was thinking back to those white-coated technicians that had got him all ready to go into space. I thought, well, if I get this bowline knot wrong, he could fall 130 feet, and that would really put our expedition on the map. I was trying to look on the bright side. Anyway, the knot seemed to work all right. The other guy on the left there was keeping an eye on me. Neil Armstrong went down into the cave, had a good look around, saw where we'd found the archaeological treasures, so-called. No libraries of gold plates, but there'd be a few PhDs coming out of it. And somebody snapped this picture of him resting against a big stalagmite, and that went into one or two of the German newspapers. And we were trying to get out in time for the last helicopter, but sadly, we missed it. I say sadly, it wasn't entirely sad, because there was it meant that Neil Armstrong had to spend a night in the jungle. We didn't have much food. We had plenty of beer, and so we sat around this campfire, and it was all a bit awkward to start with. Then as it started to go dark, I know you'll probably think I'm making this up. He looked up, saw the moon, and said, "Ah, that reminds me of 1969. The moon was just in that phase when we went to the moon." And then he spent 20 minutes telling us about his experiences. And I must admit, I can't remember a thing about it. I was so awestruck at what he was saying. I wish I'd had a tape recorder. Well, by then the expedition's winding down and we have to get ourselves back to Quito. So another traumatic bus journey, loading the aircraft. And on the way, we passed by a mountain called Sangay, active volcano. What we didn't realise was at the very moment that we flew past Mount Sangay, a British expedition had been climbing up there, and they were above the snow line when the volcano erupted. And 3 or 4 of them were hit by volcanic bombs and were either killed or seriously injured. So as soon as we got to Quito, the British ambassador asked us if some of us would like to go back and pick up the bodies. We declined. I don't know if we did the right thing, but we didn't feel as though we could cope after nearly 6 weeks in living in jungle conditions. It was just too big an ask, so the locals had to go and organise themselves. There we are, back in Quito. Just had 1 or 2 days for tourism, and then flying back via Miami to London. Now, very quickly, to tell you what's happened since then, I won't drag this out, honestly. Tree Films in Glasgow made a film which was broadcast on, I think it was London Weekend Television in those days. A documentary lasted about an hour. And the producer, Bill Forsyth, went on in 1983 to make a very well-known film called Local Hero. If you don't know the film, you'll probably recognise the music if I was to play it. In 1998, Thomas Friedman gave an account in his book about Neil Armstrong visiting Jerusalem. And it went like this. His guide pointed out, these are the steps that lead to the temple. And so Neil Armstrong said, so you must have walked here many times. And the guy confirmed that. And Neil Armstrong said, so Jesus stepped right here. That's right, said the guide. To which Armstrong is said to have replied, I have to tell you, I'm more excited stepping on these stones than I was stepping on the surface of the moon. As you may know, Neil Armstrong died in August 2012, aged 82. Stan Hall, who'd organised the expedition from Scotland, wrote a book, still believing that the metal plates were there to be found somewhere in the cave or nearby. Steve Callan, the SAS guy who I mentioned earlier with the axe, died shortly afterwards, and there was a tribute to him in this book called SAS Heroes. He'd been awarded a MBE for one of his inventions, which was a little soap tray, a pink soap tray that they would leave in the jungle for the enemy to pick up. And as soon as they picked up this curious pink object, it would explode. So for his services to the military, he was awarded an MBE. Margaret and I had the opportunity to visit the Armstrong Air and Space Museum in Wapakoneta, Ohio. That was in October 2012. And then it was picked up by the Echo when I went to work at Bourton-on-the-Water. More recently, there's been a flood of books and videos about the Los Tayos caves. One of the most influential was 3 years ago in the theme of ancient aliens, and there's a channel on Sky dedicated to this theme of ancient aliens, that little green men from outer space have visited planet Earth and that kind of thing. The one good thing that came out of this particular documentary, if you remember the sump pool that I mentioned where the cave flooded up, they were there with the film crew when the cave had dried up, and they were able to go through into some new passages. I took that picture off the television. It's not very good, but there are some passages beyond there heading towards the river at the bottom of the cave. Stanley Hall's daughter has picked up the mantle from her father, who passed away a few years ago, and she's now drawing attention to the Los Tayos caves, and she's doing her best to have the caves designated as a World Heritage Site. The video that I mentioned earlier, which had been a documentary on London Weekend Television, was about to be scrapped. So Rob and I decided we'd upload it onto YouTube. in 3 sections and delete all the music so there won't be any copyright violations. And that's one of those has had 1,500 views in the last 2 years. But people still want to carry on believing that there's a library of gold plates down there in the jungle somewhere. Eileen, as you can see there, bottom right, is continuing to lead expeditions out to Ecuador every year, searching for the library of gold plates. And in fact, access to the Los Tayas caves has become an awful lot easier recently, so that regular tourists are able to visit there with a guide, and it's become much more of an adventure playground now than it certainly was back in 1976.